that is fueled by the interest in botany that is starting to kind of engross the country. Especially in the late 18th century and the early 19th century, this way of communicating via seeds. Thomas Jefferson is a great example of this. If you read his journals from his garden, he is constantly sending and receiving seeds. And a lot of this is because the first seed companies that we see don't show up until the 1780s. So prior to 1780s, any seeds that you wanted would be from another person. Coast, right? So over those 14 months, they discover, we know for sure, over 20 new species of plants that weren't documented before. They also documented a bunch more. Some of them are either things that aren't around anymore, or they are duplicates, because constantly trying to find new plants, which weren't really new, but new to him, right? New to be documented by someone who was from Europe. He was a Scotsman. He'd gone to medical school. Quite well-educated fellow. He spent some time in France studying, and by the time he comes to here in the 1830s, botany is like his hobby, right? His big hobby he likes to do. And we see all throughout his life, he's collecting both specimens and seeds to send back to Kew Gardens in England. So Kew Gardens, as you might know, I don't want to explain things you guys already know, but it was this garden started by the Dowager Princess of Wales back in the 1700s as a place to preserve unique plants. This is a time of exploration. They're bringing stuff back from all over the world. So this is her spot where she wants to plant it all, right? So by modern day now, it's an over 300-acre garden of unique species of plants. And so some of those plants were seeds sent by Dr. Tolmie back in the 1840s. And we see him continuing to send those seeds until his death in the 1880s. So his whole life he's just sending these seeds back to England. Who knows what they end up doing with them? You know, he doesn't find out, but we know now today some of them got planted, some of them just got preserved. But it's really neat to see this interest in plants that are native to our area being important enough to be sent all the way to England for preservation. So that kind of takes us to where we are right now, and I wanted to tell you guys about my favorite example of the continuation of a species of plant, which is, you guys probably know potatoes, right? Great plant to preserve. So easy. You just dig them up, you save some little potatoes, cut them up the next spring, you plant them. Easiest plant ever to keep growing. And because of that, we know that we have these really old species of potatoes. But the journey most potatoes took to get here was that they start in South America, where they're native, right? They get collected by the Spaniards. Spaniards ship them all the way back to Europe. They get grown in Spain, then they get grown in England and Ireland and everywhere else, and then eventually they export them to North America, and they get grown in North America. It's a long journey for a potato, isn't it? You wouldn't really expect that, right? South America and North America aren't that far away, but no, they have to take a trip all the way to Europe first and come back. Exactly, a very scenic route. I agree. So in the 1980s, they start doing genetic studies on this fingerling potato that they find growing in backyards here in Washington. And they realize from this genetic study that this potato was not in Europe ever. So they start to wonder, well, why? How did they get here? Potatoes can't just walk from South America to Washington. It's not really a thing. It'd be cool if it was, but it doesn't really work that way. And they realized that this particular potato comes from the Neah Bay area. So Neah Bay, the local tribes there are the Makah. And back in 1791, if I have my years right, I think sometime around then, spring of 1791, the Spanish tried to start a colony in Neah Bay. Now, if you've ever been to Neah Bay, the weather there is not the most pleasant, especially if you're moving here from South America. So they find out that it is very cold, very windy, very rainy. It's not a good port for their ships. They're having issues with, trying to bring in ships is not working well. And so by spring of 1792, they leave, which is fair. But they leave behind what's left of their settlement, including the gardens that they planted. And from there, at least the assumptions that we can make is that the macaw continued to grow some of the plants that were left in those gardens. Because we see the macaw trading Spanish potatoes with passing by ships to get supplies that they wanted. And from there, we see at Hudson Bay Company Holdings, because Hudson Bay Company ships are one of those ships coming past, them growing Spanish potatoes as well. So today we know those potatoes as Ozette fingerling, Ozette being the lake that's up in Nia Bay. And it's crazy to think that just this backyard potato that people were growing up there for centuries has such a backstory behind it. It's been grown elsewhere since then, but it's not even recognized as a variety of potato until the 1980s. But it's been growing in the same places for over 200 years before we even really realize where it came from. So that's definitely my favorite example of seed propagation and maintaining these heritage varieties of plants for such a long amount of time. My other recent favorite one is we were conducting some research on flint corn. So flint corn is corn that you grind for flour, right? A lot of people don't grow flint corn anymore. Unless you really like cornmeal, you don't have a reason to grow it. So it hasn't really been maintained in the same way. And we were looking for a specific variety of flint corn that was called Early Canadian White, which was recorded as being one of the favorite flint corns grown in the Pacific Northwest. But it turns out the Early Canadian White doesn't seem to exist after 1900. And I found in a Canadian company that they had Early Canadian White, which I was very surprised because I didn't think it had been grown for the last 120 years. But it turns out that they had this corn because a local botanist had put out a call on a radio show saying, if you have neat varieties of corn, send them to me. And this one lady sent him this corn that had been growing for hundreds of years in her family. And she sends him seven little seeds of corn, plants them, they grow, get seed, they keep planting them. And so today this one company in Canada has that type of corn when essentially no one else, at least that I've found, in North America still grows Canadian White. But it was thanks to that one lady who had been saving those seeds for generations that we still have this specific variety of corn. So, if you are interested in going this route of saving heritage seeds, there are a couple things you have to consider as you garden. So the first important thing you've got to do is plan your garden correctly, right? So that means you choose seeds that are going to be able to be saved, especially open pollinated seeds. So any sort of hybrid variety, when you plant the seed that you save from them, they're not going to produce true, right? Because there are two plants that are crossed to produce this one seed. When you plant that, it's not going to be the same. I always think of it like if you take a seed from, maybe you have this dwarf apple tree, right? You take a seed from one of those apples and you plant it, and then it grows into this really tall, crazy tree. You're like, that doesn't make sense. It was a dwarf tree. Well, it's because it was grafted onto rootstock, right? The apple is different than the root. Hybrid seeds are kind of like that. They're not going to grow into the same thing that you took the seed from. So you have to start with open pollinated seeds. Most heritage varieties of seeds, well, pretty much all of them, they wouldn't be heritage seeds if they were not open pollinated. Hybrid seeds are a more recent thing that start coming around in the early 20th century. So if you start with seeds that you know will produce true, you also then have to lay out your garden in a way that you can save the seeds as well. So a lot of plants will cross-pollinate. Corn is a big one for this. If you plant that corn too close, the pollination is going to blow back and forth in the wind, and then you won't end up planting. If you planted like a bloody butcher corn and you planted your white flint corn too close together, your seeds that you get are going to be some weird combination of bloody butcher corn and white corn, and it's not going to be what you want. So corn is a big one for planting distances apart where the air won't carry that pollen. I included on there a really great link to a chart that Seed Savers put out that shows distances to put between plants to keep cross-pollination from happening. So definitely something to take into account as you plant your seeds. The other one is that not every plant produces seeds every year. As we know, there's, annuals, biennials, perennials. They all produce seeds at different times. So one thing that we've done in the past at the fort is when you have biennials that you want to save for the second year so you get the seed from them, like carrots, perhaps. We've done something where we'll take those biennials and put them into a separate bed at the end of the season. So that bed goes untouched over winter, and then next year when they produce, you have them there, but you also still have the rest of your beds free. So having a biennial bed that's kept for that second year is very helpful to make sure you get those seeds as well. Because otherwise, when you dig up your garden at the end of the year, maybe you're not thinking about leaving a couple carrots for seeds the next year. So having them separate, super helpful. Let's see. I'm going to peek at this so I remember what's next. Yes. I had a couple more things though. I'm forgetting. Well, we'll move on. So the second thing is knowing when your seeds are ready. A lot of us, I think my favorite example for us is a lot of us like green beans, right? Green beans are one of my favorite vegetables. If you pick your green beans when they're ready to eat and you tried to save them for seed, you'd be out of luck because those seeds are not mature for planting. The plants are maybe ready to eat, but not ready to plant. So you have to start by planting enough that you have what you want to harvest as well as what you want to save. And then you have to wait, of course, for that time for the seeds to mature. Knowing how to harvest seeds is as far as I'm aware, it's a lot of trial and error. A lot of seeds are harvested in very different ways. Some of them you leave on the plant until they're mature. Some of them you'll want to pick and then let sit for a while before you harvest seeds. Some of them you take out the seeds and you're going to wash them first, right, and see which seeds are viable, which ones float, which ones drop to the bottom of the water, and then make sure that they're dry enough. And then the last thing is that you store your seeds correctly. I love one of our old-time gardeners stores her seeds like this. Anyone recognize these? I'm surprised she still has them, but they're fantastic because you can see it's a dark color, so it's helping keep light off your seeds. And then of course where you store them is going to be very essential. So a lot of people store them in their fridge because it's nice and cool and dry. My dad, who is an avid gardener and has been forever, his garden is probably half the size of this garden, but still quite large for one person. He stores them in his greenhouse in the winter because it's still dry in there, at least as opposed to outside, which, this is Washington. Humidity is kind of a problem at hand for sure. Another great thing to do is that if you're storing them in jars or plastic like this, those little silica desiccant packages you get to keep things dry? Couple of those in with your seeds definitely aids them in staying dry. And then you can't store them too long, can you? Seeds don't last forever. As much as we'd like them to, they only will last for a few years. So that's when it comes down to labeling them. Labeling is super important. These ones aren't a great example. They don't have a year on them. But if you label them with the year, and then also if you know their scientific name, adding that on there will definitely help you in the future when you're trying to hunt down which parsnip you put in that jar. If you know the scientific name, it's going to be a lot easier to track that down, so you're not sitting there like, which one was it? Or our recent one is turnips. We had 2 different white turnips that were getting grown, and we saved seeds, and no one knows which white turnip's which. So you plant them, and you're like, oh yeah, they're both turnips, but they don't look, but who knows which one's which is great, you know. It makes it kind of hard to save seed for the next year then, because they look pretty similar. So I included a few links down there for other sites that have a helpful information. But I definitely recommend when you start saving seeds to start simple. You know, start with things that you can collect easily. Start with potatoes, start with beans, things that dry on the vine and you can just take and shell them, and it's pretty straightforward, and move up from there. I'll say the last piece of advice I'll leave you with is to take copious notes. And this is something I've been learning very much over the last couple of years. As much as you think you'll remember something the next year, you probably won't. So the more that you can keep, draw out your garden layout from last year. Write down when you planted the seeds, what the weather is like, how long it took for them to come up, how they did when they came up, how long it took until you harvest them. If you're saving your own seeds, you can't always go back to your seed catalog and see how many days it takes for this plant to produce. So taking all these notes and track how well they did over winter if they're a biannual is going to save you a lot of headaches down the road. So notes, all the notes, write everything down even if it doesn't seem important. Maybe you're leaving a journal for the future generations. Just like at the fort, we look at the journal of occurrences that they wrote